New Orleans Saints quarterback Derek Carr told us on Saturday that he feels he would be able to face the world with wide receiver Michael Thomas. Now he gets his chance. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, we're free and available on all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today Saints Wire, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, it's Wednesday, so we're going to go through our midweek mock draft, focus on fixing the defensive line and really the front seven, how the New Orleans Saints can address that. So we got a 4-round mock draft for you to cap off the show. But we'll also take a look at rounding out the wide receiver room because the New Orleans Saints make big news on Tuesday, my apologies, this is Wednesday's episode, by keeping Michael Thomas in New Orleans. Now, this, let me just be very clear, is a win-win move for the New Orleans Saints. Michael Thomas, this is a great setup for the both of them. This is a good move by the New Orleans Saints. Even though at an earlier point this offseason, following the Week 18 game against the Carolina Panthers, when the Saints restructured and reworked Michael Thomas's contract, it looked like Michael Thomas would soon be on his way out the door. That's probably why he took to Twitter today after reaching the one-year agreement with the New Orleans Saints for 2023 and tweeted simply, "Oops." And it's me. Hi, I'm Oops. Because I 100% thought that Michael Thomas was very likely going to be out of the door this offseason. When you set up a contract and restructure, rework a deal so that $30 million becomes guaranteed 2 days, on Friday, 2 days after the free agency period begins, another $30 million, $30+ million would have become guaranteed in 2024 if you would have played 4 games in 2023. Those things are very cumbersome for a team to want to have $60 million become guaranteed a year from now based on things that can and may not happen in 2023. But the Saints and Michael Thomas going back to the drawing board, reworking that deal entirely. And this works out really well 3 different ways, right? The first of which is that, well, I'll say 4, because the first of which is that it keeps Michael Thomas in New Orleans, a guy that Derek Carr, when he signed with the New Orleans Saints, was very excited to get an opportunity to work with. And that, was a part of, Michael Thomas was a part of the recruiting efforts to get Derek Carr here to New Orleans. Although Derek Carr telling us that he didn't really recruit him. He just kind of said, okay, when are we getting to work? You're wasting time. Time's ticking. I'm ready to get to work. Let's get this done. But big for the New Orleans Saints there. The second piece is that it's big for the Saints because it protects them, right? This 1-year deal is a $10 million deal. Now, keep in mind that before the Saints and Michael Thomas reworked that original contract, $15.5 million was the base salary of that deal. So they get him now on a $10 million contract that, without seeing the full structure of the deal yet, can save them around $5.5 million. Now, the third part of this is that it works out really, really well for the New Orleans Saints because it protects them in case Michael Thomas deals with any injury because of the fact of the $10 million base salary. But the fourth piece here is that it works out great for Michael Thomas because he was due $15.5 million in his base salary, and that $10 million has incentives so that if he performs, if he goes out and he balls out, he gets a big payday that bumps him up to $15 million in 2023 and puts him out on the market following that big performance and allows him to be able to secure another contract if he stays healthy throughout the 2023 season for 2024 and potentially beyond, whether it be with the New Orleans Saints or otherwise. So from all angles, this is a great move by the New Orleans Saints and a great move by Michael Thomas. He gets an opportunity to show up in New Orleans, sort of establish himself as a top wide receiver in the NFL, show that he can stay healthy. And if for any reason that doesn't happen, the Saints are protected because they've invested something around just $10 million and what would otherwise be a top flight wide receiver. And that's a risk that you'll take. Look at the risks that the Saints have taken when it comes to Michael Thomas over the past few years. This is kind of nothing for them, right? And it's easy to get all of this to work. We'll see what the actual contract structure is at the time that I'm recording this. That's not public, but trust we'll break that down here on the show so that you know exactly how they get it all done, how they make people mad with the, void years and the dead money and kicking it down the road and all this other stuff. Like they'll pull out all the bells and whistles as they usually do, because like Kai Harley said, while everyone's freaking out, they know what they're doing over on Airline Drive. So it's a big thing. And now when you think about sort of where the Saints are, based upon where they finished last year, where they began, and now where they're set to begin in 2023, the offense, it's looking like a strength again. Now, we're going to be a little bit careful about this, right? Last year, the offense looked like a strength as well, and we saw what happened there. Injuries set in. The offense never really got clicking. Play calling was an issue. Tendencies that were really predictable over on the offensive side. So there's a lot of things that still have to go right when this roster gets on the field. But if we're talking about this from an on-paper perspective, having Derek Carr as your starting quarterback, throwing to Michael Thomas, Chris Olave in his second year after he vowed to go away, bulk up, not lose his speed over the course of the offseason, and Rashid Shaheed, right? The speed, the need for speed, if you will. And then you bring back Juwan Johnson. You got to get things figured out in the running back room, but you've got Alvin Kamara at least at some point in 2023, we think. And you can add talent at that position pretty easily, whether it be via free agency. You could look at it via trade for like an Austin Eckler if you're okay with that injury history. And then, of course, there's an excellent running back class in this draft. So you think about all of those weapons over on the offensive side of the ball, an offensive line that, if they stay healthy, can be a very, very good one and has a lot of talent for first rounders on that that offensive line. And then Eric McCoy is your only non-first rounder. That's a pretty darn good non-first rounder. That's a really solid offense on paper, right? Now you've got to be able to translate it, get it all together, continue to add to it, continue to build it, and then make it all work on the field. And that's going to be on Pete Carmichael and the Saints coaching staff and all those other things, the execution from the players, all that. But the leadership of a Derek Carr, who, if you think back to last year, Alvin Kamara sort of talking about having a conversation with Dennis Allen about practices and see something, say something. Like, if things aren't going well, you got to say something. And then Derek Carr, right on the opposite side of that, in his introductory presser on Saturday saying, I'm going to call out what needs to be called out, particularly in practices. And his emphasis on not just being ready for Sunday, but being ready for Wednesday, so that you can have the best practice week that you can ahead of that Sunday game. All of those things come together and are starting to sound like the Saints are ready to get it right this season, where they have all the talent on the roster and on paper, but are ready to watch all of that translate out on the field. They'll still have to execute it. They'll still have to do it. The coaching staff's going to have to get it right. Pete Carmichael, play calling, offensive coordinator, all those things, like all that stuff still got to get right? But the Saints making some strides in order to get it all done. The next thing is, how do you round out this wide receiver room and or pass catching group? Because even with Michael Thomas in the building, it doesn't feel like the New Orleans Saints are quite done there yet. So how can they round out this pass catching room, particularly the wide receivers? We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. And today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by America's #1 sportsbook. It's FanDuel. And yes, the NFL season is over, but the NBA season is picking up. I'm recording this right now while the Pelicans are getting absolutely, say it with me, slaughtered by the Los Angeles Lakers. That's very disappointing. But if you want to look at other things going on around the NFL, NBA, and turn a blind eye to that game, I would not blame you. Locked On Pelicans is going to be a must listen on Wednesday, by the way. But you're not going to want to miss what you can get over at FanDuel, especially if you're a new customer, because first-time customers are going to get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets that come back if your first bet doesn't win, meaning there's no losing when it comes to your first bet. Download the FanDuel Sportsbook app today. It's safe, secure, super easy to use. It'll let you get in on things like money line, point spread, threes scored, even point scorers, all of that. You can bundle it all together for an even bigger payout in a same-game parlay as well. So don't miss out on your chance for your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets by heading over to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. New Orleans Saints getting Michael Thomas to stick around on an incentive-heavy $10 million deal that can go up to $15 million. We'll explain a little bit about how that can happen, although we don't have the specifics just yet. But really, the big focus here is, how do the Saints now round out their wide receiver room, or their pass catching group. Appreciate you as always. Make a Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So the $10 million base salary for Michael Thomas is going to be broken out and spread out like we mentioned, but I mentioned that this can get up to $15 million for Michael Thomas. Let's quickly discuss how they can do that and why still adding some talent to the wide receiver room can actually help him get it done. The thing about this is that what that extra $5 million is going to be, the difference between a $10 million foundation of the deal and the $15 million potential of the deal, is going to be incentive heavy. It'll come down to everything from availability, like percentage of snaps played, games played, playoff appearances, NFC championship appearance, Super Bowl appearances, things like that, right? Not all of those things, but some of those things and maybe others, but things about his availability, right? Hitting certain benchmarks of his availability throughout the season. The other place is going to be production. 50 catches, 60 catches, 70 catches, 80 catches, all might come with a $250,000 bonus. 600 yards, 700 yards, 800 yards, 900 yards, all could come with a $250,000 bonus, right? So they could come up with all of these different types of incentives that do it. You think about Julio Jones's contract with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers last year, and it was similar. It was a $6 million base, but then he had about another $2.5 million that he could gain on top of all that. So for Michael Thomas, and the way that they got that $2.5 million is that they had 10 different qualifiers that all clocked in at half or $250,000 a piece. So for Michael Thomas, you do that same thing. You get 10 different incentives. We give him $500,000 a piece. And then bam, he's got an extra $5 million on top of his deal, or 20 different incentives of $250,000 a piece. I don't know if there's a limit to the number of incentives that you can put down, but I feel like if you could do 10, then you could probably do 15 or 20 as well. I don't know why I started to sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger there for a moment, but hey, you know what? We're rocking. We're feeling good. So that's the way that's all going to work out in terms of increasing the earning potential of a Michael Thomas contract. So now, why then speak on the idea of adding to the wide receiver room? Wouldn't that just take production and availability away from Michael Thomas? Well, not necessarily. If you're not relying on him a ton, right, to be a 149 catch guy, but instead you're just relying on him to maybe be a 90 catch guy, that potentially prolongs his availability for you. That maybe keeps him out of certain situations that end up prolonging his ability to be on the field for you. And because he's on the field for you fresh, he's more effective and more impactful when he is on the field. And trust, he'll be on the field quite a bit, but if he's not seeing nearly 175 targets, that's probably ideal for you if you are the New Orleans Saints. So adding somebody that maybe is a pure slot receiver could make a lot of sense for New Orleans, right? Michael Thomas and Chris Olave on the outside, and then you can use Rashid Shaheed anywhere, but getting somebody that is a pure slot receiver makes a ton of sense. So where could the Saints find that? Well, there's one guy that could potentially be traded here in a little bit. We just watched Las Vegas Raiders ship out Derek Carr's old teammate, Darren Waller, the tight end, over to the New York Jets for pick 100, a third-round pick. Could the Las Vegas Raiders be looking to move on from Hunter Renfrow as well? And if so, that's probably a day 3 pick. If Darren Waller is getting traded for a third, you're looking at maybe one of the Saints' 2 fifth-round picks, maybe a 7th. One of the 2 7ths gets thrown in there as well. Maybe a future day 3 pick. I don't think that's a bad situation for New Orleans. And Las Vegas is going to have to sort of figure out what they're going to do with Hunter Renfrow sooner rather than later, because Friday, his contract effectively sets in. So because of that, they could trade him so that it conveys for another team, and the Saints could be that team to reunite Hunter Renfrow with his good buddy, Derek Carr. Now, if Hunter Renfrow is not your flavor, but you want somebody that can be a pure slot receiver, Braxton Berrios was just let go by the New York Jets as they prepare to become the New York Green Bay Packers. And so because of that, Braxton Berrios right now out on the market, and he's a pure slot receiver with a lot of speed, gives you a little bit of return ability if you need it as well. And he's somebody that can prowl the middle of the field, make those tough catches, those contested catches in congested areas of the field. So that's another good option for you as well. And that's one where you don't have to give up draft capital if you don't want to, and you get somebody that's relatively healthy, and you get somebody that can do sort of that tough work. You want a real good slot option in this year's draft that would be really, really unconventional for the New Orleans Saints, but if anyone's going to break the mold, it's this kid. How about Houston Cougars slot wide receiver Nathaniel Tank Dell? Yeah, I know he's only 5'9", But is there another receiver in the NFL that has the explosive capabilities of a Nathaniel Tank Dell? We'll call him Tank Dell moving forward, but I want to make sure you know his real name too. It's the name his mama gave him. Come on now. So you get a Tank Dell who, by all intents and purposes, is not a guy that you would expect the New Orleans Saints to draft, right? Especially when it comes to wide receiver. He's short. He's he's a little bit undersized in terms of weight. It's not usually the type of receiver that Saints go after. But I'll tell you who else didn't necessarily check the boxes of what the New Orleans Saints' previous prototype at wide receiver had been over many, many years. Chris Olave. Chris Olave came in under that 205-pound, 200-pound sort of parameter or prototype that Sean Payton really likes. So that's a wide receiver spot to where the prototype shifted when Sean Payton wasn't in the NFL, or what not wasn't in the, well, I guess he wasn't in the NFL for a little while. It wasn't the New Orleans Saints head coach anymore, and maybe for the better. Because if you remember correctly, you look at some of the guys that the Saints have drafted over the course of the past few years, Kawan Baker, Traquan Smith, like those are the wide receivers that they drafted since Michael Thomas up until Chris Olave, and those guys didn't necessarily pan out for you in terms of being big-time receivers. Not didn't necessarily, they simply didn't. So now, if the Saints are willing to bend the prototype a little bit and they want a pure slot receiver, which the Saints don't necessarily have on this roster right now. Yes, I know they have Deontay Hardy. Yes, I know they have Rashid Shaheed, but neither of those guys are pure slot receivers for you. And who knows what happens with Deontay Hardy, by the way, right? And you know Traquan Smith, the Saints went out, they drafted him. He was an outside receiver when he was at UCF. They moved him into the slot. And that's part of why things didn't work out with Traquan Smith in terms of him becoming the big guy that they had hoped that he would become with a third-round investment. But with a third-round investment or a second-round investment, you get a guy like Tank Dell, you put him in the position that you know he is going to excel at in the next level. You look at Sky Moore, you look at Kadarius Toney, he's that kind of guy. You look at Deontay Harris, right? The Deontay Hardy when he first entered the NFL and when he started to, 2021 in particular, 2021 in particular, when he started to come on with Jameis Winston, that's what you can have in a Tank Dell. But not coming off of a season-ending injury, but younger, all of those things. So those are three guys that I think if you look at pure slot receivers can come in, and there are more names. I just only have, checking my watch here, so much time to be able to get it all done. But there's a lot of different slot receivers that the Saints could go after in this year's draft. But if you trade for a Hunter Renfrow, if you sign a Braxton Berrios, if you draft a Tank Dell, those are immediate improvements at a spot right now to where you don't have a perfect fit. All three of those guys could be perfect fits as slot receivers working with Derek Carr on the inside and opposite guys like Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, and Rashid Shaheed, who of course would still get several snaps from all over the offense. Not to mention, this is a historically good tight end class. So whether you go early for a guy like Darnell Washington, who we've covered before in our comparison to Darren Waller, just in terms of size and agility, not necessarily in terms of speed. But then you look at the Luke Musgraves of the world out of Oregon State. You look at the Michael Mayers of the world out of Notre Dame. There are great receiving tight ends in this year's draft. And I mean great, that you can also go for early. It might take them a little bit of time to pan out. You might not see the success from that in 2023, but hey, you got Juwan Johnson back in the building to help shoulder the load for 1 year before you run it all back, hopefully, in 2024, if it all goes well in 2023. So the Saints have no limit in terms of options, no pun intended, no limit in terms of options of rounding out that wide receiver room in 2023. All right. Coming up next and wrapping up today's episode with our midweek mock draft, fixing the defensive line. We got 4 rounds for you, addressing the defensive line. We're going to grab a new linebacker and another one of these big slot options that the New Orleans Saints could add in this year's draft to help round out that wide receiver room. Got that coming up for you as we continue on to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at Ultimate Pro Football GM. All this stuff that we're discussing, team building, rounding out your roster, getting guys that fit your scheme, changing your scheme to fit the guys that you have. You could do all of that right here in the best mobile app available when it comes to football, right? And when it comes to professional sports, period, Ultimate Pro Football GM, everything that you need, everything that you want from that other game in its franchise mode that it stopped paying attention to years ago. Roster management, hiring coordinators, sports psychologists, team doctors, upgrading facilities, playing throughout the season, draft, free agency, every single bit of it you can get done at your own pace right here at Ultimate Pro Football GM, completely offline. So you can play it in the air, on a plane, underground, in a subway, wherever you are without having to wait for timeouts, internet connection, anything like that. So go and check them out today. Ultimate-gm.com is the website, or you can search on your mobile app, Ultimate Pro Football GM. Don't forget to use the promo code Locked On in the game store so you can get a 100% free boost to your franchise. Once again, that's promo code Locked On, all caps, in the game shop. Ultimate Pro Football GM in your app store, or ultimate-gm.com. Go grab it today. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with our midweek mock draft. Just 4 rounds to take a look at how the New Orleans Saints can address their defensive line, how they can also address the big loss of Caden Ellis, and how they can add one of those guys to help round out that wide receiver room / pass catching group. So let's bring up if you're watching on video, we're going to bring it up, but don't worry, we're going to highlight it here for those of you listening as well. So I started off here at pick 29 at defensive interior. I still think that the Saints are obviously going to address defensive tackle far before they get to the NFL draft. We highlighted a bunch of names in yesterday's episode if you want to go back to that, but there's a big time free agency pool out there of players, and it seems that there's more players every day that are getting added to that pool as there are players that are getting signed out of that pool. So lots of ways for the Saints to continue to add talent there. They could reunite with Sheldon Rankins. They can go after a Larry Ogunjobi. Quentin Jefferson just got released by the Seattle Seahawks. They could reunite with Mario Edwards Jr. They can go, lower. They can find another guy on a cheaper deal who's coming off of a rookie contract like Taven Bryan from the Cleveland Browns, who worked with Joe Woods just last year. They can find those guys that could be rotational. But if you want somebody that's going to be able to come in for you and be a leader, a snap leader, a starter for you, Bryan Bresee is where I go to start this one off. Sorry, I just realized I'm just now saying his name for the first time. I usually don't do it to y'all. But Bryan Bresee out of Clemson is where I'm starting. Yes, he had a down year in 2022, but he also had the passing of his sister. He had a ton of things that he had that were going on with him in his personal life that wasn't necessarily football related. I think you'll excuse him when we're talking about a guy who was the #1 recruit in the nation when he was recruited by Clemson. And he's got other guys that he can bring with him to New Orleans as well. I'll give you an example of one of those guys here in just a moment. Round 2, pick 20, I went with Iowa linebacker Jack Campbell. This is usually the place where I double back and grab another defensive end, an edge rusher like Adetomiwa Adebawore out of Northwestern. But instead I decided to wait on edge rusher because it's a deeper class. Way deeper than linebacker is. I go with Jack Campbell, who gives you a very Caden Ellis-like skill set, can do a little bit of everything all over the field, can rush the passer, can cover, is great in run defense, shoulders, like above the shoulders football. Would honestly be a guy that I could see the Saints developing to be Demario Davis's successor in this draft class, or in this defense. At pick 71 in the 3rd round, I grabbed A.T. Perry, the Wake Forest wide receiver, big body, 6'2", 6'3", 200 plus pounds, ran a great 40 time. He was in that 4.4 range. Got a fairly good contested catch percentage there as well, but he's a guy that you could actually stick in the slot and let him go to work, especially with that speed, with the agility that he packs, with that size, his ability to be able to box out. He's got great body control, good tracking ability, all of those things. So just an example of one of the several guys that you, of varying molds that you can grab that can be impactful for you as a pure slot player or as a big slot player all over, this year's draft to add into what you've got that's going really well for you in terms of wide receiver if all of those guys can stay healthy. And then finally here at pick 70, I can't see it. Sorry, it's so small. At pick 115, my apologies, K.J. Henry, another 5-star recruit, just like Bryan Bresee. Bring 2 of the teammates from Clemson here to New Orleans. The Saints are already set to meet with another Clemson defensive end, Miles Murphy, April 11th. He told reporters during his pro day, and that is a big group of defensive linemen hitting this year's draft class that would all be able to come in and have an immediate impact. KJ Henry's long, he's bendy, he's all the things that the New Orleans Saints like, but has a really good pass rushing plan, is solid in the run game as well. Somebody that you can plug and play pretty quickly in rotation, right? You don't even really need a starter at edge. You can plug and play him in rotation with Cam Jordan and with Carl Granderson as well. So just to recap, leading off this draft, interior defensive lineman out of Clemson, Bryan Bresee. 2nd round, Jack Campbell, linebacker out of Iowa. A.T. Perry, wide receiver. out of Wake Forest in the 3rd round. And then wrapping this up in terms of just the 4-round mock draft, KJ Henry, the edge rusher out of Clemson. So you get those guys that are going to help you rebuild that defensive line. If you think about, like, let's just say, hypothetically, the Saints sign Larry Ogunjobi. They sign Taven Bryan, to put Taven Bryan and Joe Woods back together. And then let's say they go out and they grab, let's say they reunite with Sheldon Rankins, right? And then you're starting guys like Bryan Bresee and Sheldon Rankins next to one another. And then you're rotating in Taven Bryan and Larry Ogunjobi. It's pretty good, solid scenario for you to be in for your new defensive line coach and Todd Grantham, your new defensive coordinator and Joe Woods, even though the defense is still very much Dennis Allen's, of course. And then you add in Jack Campbell to be that extra piece at the second level, along with Demario Davis and Pete Werner, save you just in case you have any injuries to that position. DeMarco Jackson comes back. He's healthy going into 2023. You've got other guys that are on that linebacker room as well, including, Zach Braun is still on the roster. Not Noah Sewell. You can go and grab Noah Sewell later on in the draft if you want to, but his brother Nephi Sewell is still in the room as well. And then A.T. Perry helps you round out that wide receiver room. You can then go into, those 2 picks that you have in the 5th round feeling pretty good about what you've done so far in terms of getting impact players rounds 1 through 4 that can get on the field for you. And then you spend your 2/5 to maybe move up and go and grab a tight end that you like, or a running back that you like, because I didn't grab a running back in those first 4 rounds. You can use those 2 7th round picks to help you move around as well. The Saints would just have a lot of options throughout all of this in terms of when they want to address. I mean, me not going for a running back in those first 4 rounds doesn't mean that you don't get a really good one still in the 5th if somebody tumbles, or maybe you go for, the TCU running back that's got a ton of talent and should be a 3-down running back in the NFL. You get a guy like a Kenny McIntosh out of Georgia who does a little bit of everything. There's so many options in this year's draft, and still running backs in free agency that they can go after as well. So the bottom line is that, I know the Saints got sort of their defensive line purged in a way, right? That exodus that happened on Monday, but they're not in a situation here to where they're without solutions, right? And even without hitting the panic button, they're far from without solutions. So that's the way that I would use our mock draft so far. We'll revisit on Mock Draft Monday, see how the entirety of the first week of free agency goes for the New Orleans Saints. But so far, some good, some bad. All right, they get to keep Michael Thomas. They bring in Derek Carr. They keep JT Gray, Juwan Johnson, but they lose, Marcus Davenport, David Onyemata, Shy Tuttle, potentially Malcolm Roach. We'll see what happens there. And then Caden Ellis. But those are guys that you can replace in your system because of the way that your system supports those positions, right? So not ideal, but not the end of the world either. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, it's Thursday, so we'll continue to break down our draft prospects. Let's go a little bit deeper when it comes to Bryan Bresee and how he could fit, as well as other defensive tackles the Saints could potentially invest in as early as day 1 or day 2 in the NFL draft. We'll have those coming up for you, so you're aware of all of those options in this year's draft well before we get there in April. I appreciate you as always for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out Locked On NFL Draft. Damian Parson, Keith Sanchez, giving you everything you need to know, that championship level knowledge that you need to know about your favorite NFL draft prospects and how they can affect your franchise. Find them wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. Appreciate you as always, making me part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show as always. If you see me, say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation, I'll holla at you.